Phil, that one I particularly enjoyed. I'm very interested in Thomas Merton and Thomas Keating and all the Christian contemplatives, and I thought Jim did a fabulous job. You've known him for a while, haven't you?
Yes, I've known Jim for probably 15 years. We live about 10 minutes away from each other in LA. And when I first met him, I was just intrigued because somebody told me they had been to a retreat with him. And I thought, wow, there's some guy out there who knew Merton and he's teaching courses in Christian meditation, bringing in Buddhism and other teachings. I got to meet this guy. And so I did, and it was partly because I was researching American Veda, probably.
Well,
And then we became pals, and so every month or so we have breakfast in a favorite place near us, and I am a great admirer of his, and I think he's doing great work out there in the
yeah,
world.
I mentioned to him that I had on a number of occasions had interaction with Thomas Keating, who I guess is a contemporary. He was a contemporary. He's in his 90s now, so maybe he was probably 6 or 7 years younger than Thomas Merton, because Thomas Merton would be 100 this year. Uh, and
Right.
uh, and also I have a friend that's down in Paul Marischal, brother Elias, that was his name, down in a one of the Trappist monasteries in Georgia. And it is fascinating. And you mentioned this. I grew up Catholic, and I went to Catholic camp, and I got all kinds of catechism and teaching. I never heard anything about the Trappists or the contemplative orders or the Desert Fathers. And when it did come up, even amongst priests and nuns, it was like the strange part of the church where these people go into deep seclusion, and it's a special calling, and it was certainly nothing for anybody in the world. So the fact that it's getting integrated into you know um, regular religious practice for ordinary folks is something very new, and it's the kind of thing you address in your book, American Veda, that
Yeah.
change, that transformation.
Yeah, and I think one could make the case that one of the reasons these teachings have come out of the closet and have become more democratized within the world of Christianity, especially Catholicism, is that people like Thomas Keating back in the 70s were curious about the popularity of Buddhist meditation forms and Hindu meditation forms at the height of the TM movement's
Right.
popularity. He was investigating these things and eventually brought out uh, a centering prayer as a result. And so that's the reason I write about this in American Veda, that I think the Eastern teachings were catalysts for bringing these teachings out of the woodwork. What you said was echoed in many of my interviews with people who grew up Catholic. They had this pull, or at least a curiosity about the inner experiences they might have been exposed to, either from gurus or some exposure to the Christian mystics, and it was often discouraged by their priests or nuns.
Right. It was
Uh,
something they had no vocabulary for and
yeah,
seemed to have no interest in.
yeah, and sometimes even said, don't go there. This is not
Right.
for you.
Right.
And in fact, one of the people I interviewed is an American-born woman who's a lineage holder in a Swami tradition, and the reason she went in that direction was she was pulled toward the mystical experience, and her Catholic mentors just discouraged her. So she said, "Well, I guess I have to look elsewhere."
Right.
And she,
One thing, Phil, I'd recommend to our listeners, regardless of their religion or if they're agnostic or atheist or whatever, if you have a chance, go to one of these monasteries like St. Joseph's Abbey. Sometimes men and women can go. Sometimes women
yeah,
can only go to the women abbey or whatever. But you can go and you can usually watch through a window and then do their prayer, and then you can usually interact with one or more of the nuns or monks there. And what was fascinating for me is I expected them to be very cold, dreary people, where they're warm, happy, loving folks. And I'm generalizing, but I was shocked that they were nothing that I thought they might be like. So
Yeah. And you can even in many of these places take a private retreat
right,
and participate to whatever degree in their rituals, but also have your own private meditation time and prayer time or whatever. In fact, for many people, I know a lot of yogis and people who do Buddhist meditation, when they want to go off on a silent retreat, they'll often go to a Catholic retreat house because they're the most accessible. They're,
right.
convenient and so forth. There are fewer of them now than there used to be, but there's still plenty of them around most metropolitan areas.
Right. I mean, not an enormous number of people are going into the monastery anymore, and they don't make. It's not like anybody can just go into the monastery and become a monk. It's in terms of in Catholicism anyway. It's a long process, and they weed out many. And matter of fact, last time I visited St. Joseph's Abbey in Spencer, Massachusetts, I spoke to two novices, one of whom was already a priest but thinking of going into a contemplative life. And he said, after so many months there, he thought he'll give it a little bit longer try, but it probably wasn't for him. The other guy seemed like it was for him. So it's interesting, it's a big world. There's all kinds of people, but I think the real interesting thing, and it's something that you've been talking about a long time, is that the democratization that these procedures and techniques and can be utilized by people, not just monks, but people in the day-to-day working world.
Yeah, and I think that people are awakening to that more and more. And we should add that the monastery you mentioned in Spencer, Mass, is where Thomas Keating was presiding back in the 70s when he started looking into other, these various forms of meditation and brought out centering prayer.
Yeah, there was another fellow with him, Pennington, and he wrote a book called Daily We Touch Him, I think it was called. And, those books had a very profound effect on a lot of people. I still run into folks. Oh, yeah, I've been reading that for a long time. It had a huge impact on my life because you and I, Phil, have been involved in meditation for many years. But a lot of folks, still haven't had much exposure to it. And then all of a sudden, hey, there's this whole other dimension to life that I wasn't aware of before. And when people do become aware of it, it's quite moving. It's quite exciting for them.
It is, and I've heard the same kind of thing many, many times. I was raised without any religion, and in fact, by people who thought religion was ridiculous. And when I began to do my spiritual search in the '60s, it was directly. I directly turned to the East because that's where you had this sense of practical spirituality and sort of mystical practices that could actually be employed in your life. And so I was turned on to that by people like Alan Watts and so forth. And then I met somebody who told me about Thomas Merton, and I never heard of him. And I read one of his books or section of it or something. I said, oh, my God. They had this kind of thing in Catholicism, because in my world, Catholicism was, Catholic friends of mine and schoolmates who hated going to church.
Yeah.
Or,
it was all about bingo.
Yeah. Or it was, pronouncements from the Vatican that everybody, in my world was mocking. And, that's all I knew. And similar with Judaism. I didn't know anything about Judaism except what, people told me about going to synagogue or observing holidays. And then it turned out, they have this incredible mystical tradition of Kabbalah and so forth.
Yeah. I think for most Christians, most Christians, most folks from the Judeo-Christian tradition, when they are exposed to Eastern thought, Eastern teachings, they thought, okay, those religions are experiential. Judaism, Catholicism, Christianity in general is not. Whereas in fact, that was always most always a part of it. So.
Yeah, but sort of hidden.
Right.
And the truth is, a lot of the practices that came here with all the gurus and yogis, they're not widely practiced in India either.
Right.
because it was only these uh, the gurus and swamis and yoga masters who saw that there would be benefit for ordinary householders that started bringing these
Right.
teachings out.
Right. I met many Hindus who felt they knew about meditation, but weren't actually practicing. Just like
Right.
anybody else in the world. We should probably wrap it up. But the next time we have Jim on, I'd like to. It'd be fun to discuss with him how he incorporates all this into his practice of clinical psychology.
Yes, I meant to bring that up, and it's definitely something I've talked to him about it privately, and it's very interesting. He's sort of the Christian equivalent of. Remember, we had John Prendergast on the
Right.
show, and he's a psychotherapist who brings in non-dual teachings, and his whole sensibility is informed by these, but they tend to be from the non-dual Vedantic tradition, whereas Jim's bringing it in a different way, but it's very similar, and it's definitely worth exploring with them. The other thing I think is worth mentioning is what he was talking about, Merton's emphasis on people finding inspiration and insight from traditions other than their own, and people coming to experience the sort of core unitive experience that's at the heart of every tradition. This is a terribly important modern phenomenon that many people are discovering, and it breaks down the boundaries, artificial boundaries among religions, and it's also the essence of what people like Aldous Huxley called the perennial philosophy. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, what Jim just articulated and quoted Merton as saying is essentially that core teaching of the perennial
Right. Right.
philosophy, that if you go deep enough into any tradition experientially, you come to this
Right.
same unity.
Right. I think that's great, and certainly, 40, 50 years ago, that was a major no-no in
Yes.
Catholicism. But anyway, Phil, till next time, great show,
Okay.
and let's have him back on again soon.
Okay. Next time.